The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Phoenix as Marcus Rodriguez crouched behind an overturned delivery truck, his weathered hands gripping a modified baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. 3 weeks had passed since the outbreak began, and the once bustling city now resembled a graveyard of concrete and steel. The silence was deceptive. Marcus knew that dozens of infected wandered just blocks away, drawn by the slightest sound or movement. His military training from 2 tours in Afghanistan had prepared him for combat, but nothing could have prepared him for this nightmare that had consumed America. The undead moved differently than any enemy he'd ever faced, their jerky, unnatural gait and relentless hunger making them both predictable and terrifyingly persistent. Marcus adjusted his position, careful not to let his boots scrape against the asphalt as he surveyed the street ahead. His destination was the abandoned pharmacy 3 blocks north, where he hoped to find antibiotics for Emma, the sick child back at their makeshift camp. The sound of shuffling feet echoed from around the corner, and Marcus tensed as he counted at least 6 distinct sets of footsteps approaching. The infected rarely traveled alone anymore, they seemed to be developing pack behavior, something that made survival exponentially more difficult. He reached for the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt and whispered into it, "Jake, this is Marcus. I've got multiple contacts approaching from the east. Might need backup if this goes sideways." The radio crackled softly before Jake Thompson's voice came through, barely audible. Jake was a former mechanic from Detroit who had joined their group after his family was overrun in the early days of the outbreak. His practical skills with vehicles and electronics had proven invaluable, but more importantly, he was someone Marcus could trust to watch his back. "Copy that, Marcus. I'm 2 blocks south with Rebecca. We can be there in 5 minutes if you need us." Rebecca Martinez had been a trauma surgeon before the world ended, and her medical expertise had saved more lives in their group than Marcus could count. She was also fiercely protective of the survivors under her care, especially the children they had rescued along the way. Her transition from saving lives in sterile operating rooms to fighting for survival in the streets had been remarkable to witness. She carried herself with the same precision and determination that had made her an excellent surgeon, but now those skills were applied to field medicine and tactical planning. The pharmacy run was her idea. Emma's fever had spiked overnight, and without proper medication, the 8-year-old girl might not survive another day. Emma had been found hiding in a school basement 2 weeks ago, her parents among the infected that the group had been forced to put down. The memory still haunted Marcus, but in this new world, mercy sometimes looked like a bullet to the head. The infected rounded the corner in a shambling line, their torn clothing and pale, mottled skin making them look like walking nightmares. Marcus counted 7 of them, including what appeared to be a former police officer still wearing fragments of his uniform and a woman in a hospital gown whose arms hung at unnatural angles. The transformation process varied from person to person, but the result was always the same: complete loss of humanity and an insatiable hunger for living flesh. Marcus had learned to look past their former lives and see them for what they had become, threats that needed to be eliminated. The closest infected was a middle-aged man in a business suit, his tie askew and his face bearing the telltale signs of the infection: clouded eyes, blackened veins visible beneath translucent skin, and the slack-jawed expression of someone whose higher brain functions had ceased to exist. Moving with practiced silence, Marcus emerged from his hiding spot and approached from behind. The infected were notorious for their poor peripheral vision, a weakness that experienced survivors had learned to exploit. His first strike was clean and efficient, the barbed wire-wrapped bat connecting with the businessman's skull with a wet thud that dropped him instantly. The sound alerted the others, and they began turning toward Marcus with that characteristic jerky motion that never failed to send chills down his spine. Years of military training kicked in as he moved into combat mode, his body operating on pure instinct and muscle memory. The second infected, the former police officer, lunged forward with surprising speed, but Marcus sidestepped and brought his weapon up in a devastating uppercut that sent the creature sprawling backward. The remaining 5 infected converged on his position, their moaning calls likely to attract more from the surrounding buildings. Marcus knew he had perhaps 60 seconds before this skirmish became a full-scale battle for survival. He keyed his radio while swinging at the hospital gown-wearing woman. "Jake, Rebecca, I need that backup now. This is about to get very messy." The woman's reaching arms came within inches of his face before his bat connected with her temple, dropping her to the pavement. For left, but he could already hear more footsteps echoing from nearby streets. The infection had changed everything about combat. There were no wounded enemies to worry about, no prisoners to take, and no mercy to be shown. It was kill or be killed, and hesitation meant death not just for Marcus, but for everyone depending on him back at camp. The remaining 4 infected closed in on Marcus as the sound of running footsteps announced Jake and Rebecca's arrival from the south. Jake appeared first, wielding a crowbar that had become his signature weapon, while Rebecca followed with a tactical knife and a small-caliber pistol she preferred for close-quarters encounters. The coordination between the 3 survivors had developed naturally over weeks of fighting together, each understanding their role without need for verbal communication. Marcus continued his assault on the nearest infected, a teenage boy whose Letterman jacket was torn and blood-stained, while Jake flanked around to engage 2 others that had been shuffling toward them from a side alley. Rebecca immediately began scanning the surrounding area for additional threats, her medical training having taught her the importance of situational awareness and threat assessment. "We've got more coming from the north," she called out, spotting at least 3 additional figures emerging from behind a collapsed bus shelter. The pharmacy was still 2 blocks away, but their current position was becoming increasingly compromised as more infected were drawn by the sounds of combat. Jake's crowbar work was brutal and efficient as he took down the first of his targets, a former construction worker whose hard hat had somehow remained attached throughout his transformation. The sickening crunch of metal against bone echoed through the street as Jake pivoted to face the second infected, an elderly woman whose floral dress was stained with dark, unidentifiable fluids. Marcus finished off the teenager and immediately moved to assist Rebecca, who had drawn her knife to engage the former police officer that had managed to regain his footing after Marcus's earlier strike. The infected officer still wore his duty belt, though his service weapon was missing, probably taken by another survivor or lost during his transformation. Rebecca's surgical precision served her well in close combat, her blade finding the sweet spot at the base of the skull that would immediately sever the brain stem and drop an infected person instantly. "Marcus, we need to move now," she urged, wiping her blade clean on the officer's torn uniform. "That gunshot echo is going to draw every infected within 6 blocks straight to us." The group had learned early in the outbreak that noise discipline was crucial for survival, but sometimes violence was unavoidable. Marcus scanned the area one final time before signaling for them to advance toward the pharmacy, using hand signals they had developed to minimize vocal communication. Jake took point position, his mechanical background having given him an intuitive understanding of urban navigation and obstacle avoidance. Rebecca stayed in the middle, her medical bag slung across her shoulder and her pistol ready for immediate use. Marcus brought up the rear, constantly checking behind them for pursuit while maintaining visual contact with his teammates. The infected they had just eliminated would not stay down for long unless their brains were completely destroyed, a lesson the group had learned through painful experience during their first week together. The transformation process seemed to make the infected remarkably resilient to trauma that would be fatal to living humans. As they moved through the debris-strewn streets, Marcus couldn't help but remember what Phoenix had been like before the outbreak. The city had been vibrant and growing, full of families and businesses and dreams for the future. Now it was a monument to humanity's fragility, with abandoned cars scattered across roadways and buildings standing empty like hollow teeth in a skull. The government's initial response had been swift but ultimately ineffective. Military cordons had slowed the spread but never stopped it, and the safe zones had become death traps when they were eventually overrun. Marcus had been on leave when the outbreak began, visiting his sister's family in Phoenix when the first reports of violent incidents began appearing on the news. By the time the true scope of the crisis became apparent, the roads out of the city were clogged with refugees and the infected were spreading faster than anyone could contain them. His sister Maria and her husband David had been among the early casualties, leaving their daughter Emma orphaned and forcing Marcus to become both protector and father figure to a child he barely knew. Jake suddenly held up a closed fist, signaling for the group to halt as he spotted movement near the pharmacy entrance. Through the broken windows, they could see at least 4 infected wandering inside the building, probably former employees or customers who had been trapped when the outbreak reached this area. The pharmacy's metal security gate was partially down, creating a narrow opening that would force them to enter single file, a dangerous tactical situation that could easily become a bottleneck if more infected appeared. Rebecca studied the building's layout, noting the rear entrance and emergency exits that might provide alternative routes. "We could try the back door," she whispered, "but we don't know what's waiting inside the storage areas." Marcus weighed their options carefully, knowing that Emma's condition was deteriorating with each passing hour. The antibiotics they needed were likely in the pharmacy section at the back of the store, which meant they would have to clear the entire building to reach them safely. The sound of distant moaning reminded them that their earlier fight had indeed attracted attention from other infected in the area. Marcus made the decision quickly, knowing that hesitation could cost them everything. "Jake, you take the front entrance low and fast. Rebecca, circle around back and come in through the employee entrance. I'll give you both 30 seconds to get into position, then we go in simultaneously and clear room by room." The plan was simple but dangerous. Splitting up always increased risk, but it also gave them multiple angles of attack and better chances of avoiding being trapped. As they moved into position, Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, knowing that the lives of his teammates and the sick child waiting back at camp depended on the next few minutes going exactly according to plan. Jake positioned himself near the pharmacy's front entrance, crouching low beside an overturned shopping cart as he studied the infected movement patterns inside the store. Through the gap beneath the security gate, he could see the legs of at least 3 infected shuffling aimlessly between the aisles, their torn clothing and dried blood indicating they had been trapped here since the early days of the outbreak. Rebecca made her way around the building's perimeter, stepping carefully over broken glass and debris while keeping an eye out for additional threats that might be lurking in the shadows. The employee entrance was partially blocked by a delivery truck that had crashed into the loading dock, but she found a window that had been shattered during the initial chaos and carefully cleared away the remaining glass shards to create a safe entry point. Marcus counted down the seconds in his head, his grip tightening on his improvised weapon as he prepared to coordinate the simultaneous breach that would hopefully catch the infected off guard and prevent them from clustering together for a more difficult fight. The moment arrived with military precision as Jake rolled under the security gate while Rebecca slipped through her window, both entering the pharmacy from opposite ends while Marcus provided overwatch from his position outside. The first infected Jake encountered was a store clerk whose name tag still read Tommy, his green vest now torn and stained with substances that Jake preferred not to identify too closely. Tommy lunged forward with the characteristic jerky motion of the infected, but Jake's crowbar caught him in the side of the head with enough force to send him crashing into a display of over-the-counter medications. Rebecca emerged from the storage area to find herself face-to-face with an infected customer, a middle-aged woman clutching a prescription bottle in her death grip, her pharmacy loyalty card still dangling from a lanyard around her neck. The irony of the infected woman's final act being an attempt to fill a prescription was not lost on Rebecca as she quickly dispatched the threat with her knife, the blade sliding cleanly between vertebrae with surgical precision. Marcus monitored the street while his teammates cleared the interior, noting with growing concern that more infected were beginning to appear from neighboring buildings, drawn by the sounds of their entry into the pharmacy. A group of 5 emerged from what appeared to be a dental office across the street, their movements more coordinated than usual as they began shuffling directly toward the pharmacy entrance. "Jake, Rebecca, we've got company coming," Marcus warned through his radio, "at least 5 more headed your way from the southeast." Inside the store, Jake was engaged with 2 infected simultaneously, a pharmacy technician and what appeared to be a security guard whose radio was still clipped to his belt, occasionally crackling with automated emergency broadcasts that had been repeating for weeks. The guard's infected state hadn't diminished his size advantage, and Jake found himself backed against the prescription counter as he tried to maintain distance while looking for an opening to strike. Rebecca heard Marcus's warning just as she reached the pharmacy section at the back of the store, where she quickly began scanning the shelves for the antibiotics Emma desperately needed. Her medical training allowed her to quickly identify the medications they required, but the pharmacy's security measures meant that most of the serious antibiotics were locked in a reinforced cabinet behind the counter. She could hear Jake struggling with multiple infected near the front of the store, the sounds of combat echoing through the aisles as he used his crowbar to keep the creatures at bay. "I found the meds," Rebecca called out, "but I need time to break into the secured storage." The cabinet was designed to prevent theft, with reinforced steel construction that would require either the proper keys or significant force to breach. She began searching the area for tools that might help her access the medications, knowing that every second of delay increased the danger for all of them. Jake managed to drop the pharmacy technician with a well-placed strike to the temple, but the security guard proved more resilient, absorbing several blows that would have felled a living person while continuing to press his attack. The guard's duty belt contained pepper spray and handcuffs that jangled with each movement, creating an eerie soundtrack to their deadly dance among the pharmacy aisles. Jake realized he needed to change tactics and grabbed a heavy bottle of vitamins from a nearby shelf, hurling it at the guard's head to create enough of a distraction for a finishing blow. The impact staggered the infected guard just long enough for Jake to close the distance and drive his crowbar through the creature's eye socket, finally bringing it down permanently. "Front area is clear," Jake reported, but immediately added, "Marcus, how long until those reinforcements arrive?" Outside, Marcus watched as the group of 5 infected from the dental office reached the pharmacy entrance, with more emerging from buildings further down the street. The sound of their activities had created a cascading effect, drawing infected from a wider area than they had anticipated. "Rebecca, whatever you're doing back there, you need to do it faster," Marcus urged, knowing that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The original plan had been to get in and out quickly, but the secured medication cabinet was adding precious minutes to their timeline. He could see at least a dozen infected now converging on their position, and the narrow entrance that had seemed tactically advantageous was quickly becoming the trap he had feared. "We may need to fight our way out of this one," Marcus admitted, checking his weapon and preparing for what might become their most difficult battle yet. Rebecca frantically searched the pharmacy area for anything that could break open the medication cabinet, her surgical training allowing her to remain calm under pressure even as the sounds of approaching infected grew louder outside. She spotted a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall and quickly grabbed it, using the heavy metal cylinder as a battering ram against the cabinet's locking mechanism. The first impact barely dented the reinforced steel, but she adjusted her angle and struck again, this time targeting the hinges rather than the lock itself. Meanwhile, Jake had moved to the front windows to assess their deteriorating tactical situation, counting at least 15 infected now surrounding the building with more arriving every minute. The narrow entrance that had seemed like a controllable choke point was rapidly becoming a death trap as the infected began pressing against the partially lowered security gate, their combined weight threatening to either bend the metal or find gaps large enough to squeeze through. Marcus made the difficult decision to fall back from his overwatch position and join his teammates inside the pharmacy, knowing that their extraction route was about to become completely compromised. As he slipped under the security gate, he could see the infected beginning to pile up outside like water against a dam, their moaning calls attracting even more from the surrounding area. "Rebecca, please tell me you're almost through that cabinet," Marcus called out as he joined Jake near the front of the store, both men now watching as infected faces pressed against the windows with increasing intensity. The glass was holding for now, but Marcus could see stress fractures beginning to appear where the infected were applying the most pressure. Jake had found a shopping cart and was using it to reinforce the entrance, jamming it against the security gate to buy them additional precious seconds. The fire extinguisher finally did its work as Rebecca's persistent assault on the cabinet hinges caused the door to break free with a metallic screech that echoed through the store. Inside, she found exactly what Emma needed, broad-spectrum antibiotics that could fight the infection threatening the child's life, along with several other medications that would be valuable for their group's medical supplies. She quickly stuffed the bottles into her medical bag, not bothering to read labels as she grabbed everything that looked useful for treating infections, pain management, and emergency medical situations. "Got them," Rebecca announced, but her relief was short-lived as the sound of breaking glass from the front of the store indicated their time was up. Jake and Marcus watched in growing alarm as several infected managed to break through one of the larger windows, their bodies tumbling into the store in a tangle of limbs and torn clothing. The first infected through the window was a former construction worker whose hard hat had been knocked askew during his transformation, revealing a partially crushed skull that should have been fatal but somehow wasn't. Jake met him with his crowbar, the impact sending the creature sprawling back into the debris from the broken window, but two more infected were already climbing through the opening behind him. Marcus engaged the second threat, a woman in business attire whose briefcase was still handcuffed to her wrist, the metal case swinging wildly as she lunged forward with outstretched arms. His bat connected with her shoulder, spinning her around but failing to drop her as she immediately turned to continue her attack with single-minded determination that Marcus found both fascinating and terrifying. Rebecca emerged from the pharmacy area just as more glass shattered from additional windows around the store, indicating that the infected had found multiple entry points and were beginning to pour in from several directions simultaneously. The trio found themselves facing a rapidly deteriorating situation as infected streamed into the store from three different directions, cutting off their planned escape route and forcing them into a defensive position among the pharmacy aisles. "We need a new exit strategy," Rebecca shouted over the growing chaos, her medical bag secured tightly across her shoulder as she drew her pistol for the first time during their mission. Marcus quickly assessed their options, noting that the employee break room had a window that faced the alley behind the building, potentially offering an alternative escape route if they could fight their way through the infected now filling the store. Jake had managed to drop the construction worker but was immediately forced to engage two more infected who had entered through the same broken window, their numbers seeming to increase faster than the small group could eliminate them. One was a teenager wearing a fast food restaurant uniform, his name tag reading Brandon, and his visor still perched crookedly on his head despite the obvious trauma he had suffered during his transformation. The other was an elderly man whose walker had become entangled in the window frame, creating an almost comical sight that Jake couldn't appreciate given the deadly circumstances. "There's too many of them," Jake called out as he backed toward his teammates, his crowbar work becoming more desperate as the infected continued to press forward with relentless determination. Marcus realized they needed to create a distraction that would allow them to reach the break room window without fighting through the entire infected horde. He spotted the pharmacy's smoke alarm system and quickly began looking for something that would trigger it, hoping the loud noise might confuse the infected long enough for an escape attempt. Rebecca understood his plan immediately and began searching for anything flammable that could create enough smoke to set off the alarm system. She found a display of rubbing alcohol and began pouring it onto a pile of paper towels while Marcus used his lighter to prepare for ignition. "On my signal, we move fast toward the back room," Marcus instructed, knowing that their window of opportunity would be measured in seconds rather than minutes. The infected were now close enough that he could smell their decay, a nauseating mixture of rotting flesh and stagnant blood that made his eyes water. Marcus ignited the alcohol-soaked paper towels just as three more infected crashed through the pharmacy's main window, the flames immediately sending thick black smoke billowing toward the ceiling-mounted alarm system. The acrid smell of burning alcohol and paper filled the air as the smoke detector began its ear-piercing wail, the high-pitched sound causing several of the infected to pause momentarily in their advance, their primitive nervous systems apparently still capable of reacting to certain stimuli. Rebecca took advantage of the brief confusion to put down the elderly man with the walker, her knife finding its target with surgical precision while Jake continued his desperate battle against the fast food worker and two newly arrived infected who had entered through a side window. The smoke was thickening rapidly, reducing visibility throughout the store and creating additional chaos as the infected began stumbling into displays and each other in their relentless pursuit of living prey. "Move now," Marcus shouted over the blaring alarm, leading his teammates toward the employee break room as more infected poured through the various breaches they had created in the pharmacy's defenses. The break room door was unlocked, and Marcus quickly pushed it open to reveal a small space with a kitchenette, a few tables, and most importantly, a window that faced the alley behind the building. Jake was the last to reach the break room, backing through the doorway while using his crowbar to keep several infected at bay as they pressed forward through the smoke-filled store. Rebecca immediately began examining the window, noting that it was secured with a simple latch but would require them to climb down approximately 8 feet to reach the alley below. The window was just large enough for them to squeeze through one at a time, but the infected were already beginning to crowd around the break room entrance, drawn by the sound of their voices and movement. Marcus helped Rebecca open the window while Jake used a break room chair to barricade the door, buying them precious seconds as the infected began throwing themselves against the barrier with increasing violence. The chair wouldn't hold for long against their combined weight and mindless determination, but it might provide enough time for all 3 survivors to make their escape. Rebecca went first, dropping her medical bag out the window before lowering herself feet first through the opening, her compact frame making the maneuver relatively easy despite the awkward angle. Marcus watched as she landed safely in the alley below, immediately scanning for threats while signaling for Jake to follow her down. The break room door was beginning to splinter under the constant assault from the infected, and Marcus could see grasping hands reaching through gaps in the makeshift barricade. Jake tossed his crowbar down to Rebecca before attempting his own escape through the window, his larger frame making the process more difficult as he struggled to fit through the opening while the infected continued their assault on the door behind him. Marcus provided cover, using his bat to strike at any infected limbs that managed to reach through the failing barricade while keeping one eye on Jake's progress. The door finally gave way just as Jake's legs disappeared through the window, and Marcus found himself face to face with a surge of infected pouring into the break room like water through a burst dam. He had seconds to make his own escape before being overwhelmed by the sheer number of creatures pressing into the small space. Marcus dove toward the window as the first infected reached for him, their grasping fingers barely missing his boots as he tumbled through the opening and landed hard in the alley below. The trio quickly regrouped in the narrow alley, gathering their weapons and assessing their immediate situation while the sounds of frustrated infected echoed from the break room window above them. The alley provided temporary concealment from the main horde, but Marcus knew they needed to put distance between themselves and the pharmacy before the infected found alternative routes to reach them. Rebecca checked her medical bag to ensure the antibiotics were secure while Jake tested his crowbar for damage from the fight inside the store. The smoke alarm was still wailing from inside the pharmacy, and Marcus suspected the sound would continue to draw infected from throughout the surrounding area, creating a growing concentration of threats that could spread outward like ripples in a pond. "We need to move fast and quiet," Marcus whispered, leading his teammates deeper into the alley system that connected the backs of several commercial buildings. Their route back to camp would require them to cross several major streets where they could be exposed to additional infected, but staying in the alleys too long carried its own risks as the narrow passages could easily become death traps if they encountered threats from both directions. Rebecca kept pace despite the weight of her medical supplies, her determination to save Emma driving her forward even as exhaustion began to take its toll. Jake brought up the rear, constantly checking behind them for pursuit while trying to map their route back to the abandoned warehouse where their group had established their temporary base. The distant sound of the smoke alarm gradually faded as they put distance between themselves and the pharmacy, but Marcus could still hear the calls of infected echoing through the surrounding streets as more creatures were drawn toward the source of the disturbance. Their successful mission had come at a cost. They had potentially compromised their movement routes through this section of the city and created a concentration of infected that could threaten future supply runs. The antibiotics in Rebecca's bag represented hope for Emma's survival, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. The infected seemed to be adapting their behavior patterns, and the ease with which their activities had drawn such large numbers suggested that the creatures were developing new hunting strategies that could make survival increasingly difficult for the remaining human population. The alley system proved more treacherous than anticipated as the trio navigated through narrow passages cluttered with abandoned delivery trucks, overflowing dumpsters, and debris from the initial panic that had consumed the city during the outbreak's early days. Marcus led them through what had once been a thriving commercial district, now transformed into a maze of shadows and potential hiding spots for both infected and desperate survivors who might view 3 well-armed people as either threats or opportunities. Rebecca clutched her medical bag protectively, acutely aware that the antibiotics inside represented not just Emma's chance at survival, but potentially the difference between life and death for other members of their group who might fall ill in the harsh conditions they now faced daily. Jake maintained rear guard, his mechanical knowledge of urban infrastructure helping him identify potential escape routes through service tunnels and maintenance areas that most people would overlook in their desperation to find safety. As they approached the intersection where they would need to cross Main Street to continue toward their warehouse stronghold, Marcus held up his fist to signal a halt, his military instincts detecting something wrong with the scene ahead. The street was too quiet, lacking even the distant moans of wandering infected that had become the new ambient sound of their dead city. Through the gap between buildings, he could see several abandoned vehicles positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than the random chaos typical of the outbreak's initial phase. Rebecca moved up beside him, her medical training having taught her to trust her intuition when something felt off, and she too sensed that they were potentially walking into a situation that could be more dangerous than the infected they had just escaped. Jake checked their rear approach one final time before joining his teammates at the alley mouth, all three survivors now focused on the suspicious arrangement of cars and trucks that blocked their most direct route home. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow when he spotted the glint of sunlight reflecting off what appeared to be a rifle scope positioned in a second-story window overlooking the street intersection. They weren't just dealing with infected anymore. Other survivors had claimed this territory and were apparently willing to defend it with lethal force against anyone they perceived as a threat. "We've got human problems," Marcus whispered to his teammates, pointing out the sniper position and at least two other locations where he suspected armed survivors might be positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. The tactical situation was complex and dangerous, as these unknown survivors might shoot first and ask questions later, especially if they had valuable supplies or defensible positions they were protecting from raiders and desperate refugees. Rebecca's mind immediately went to Emma's deteriorating condition and the critical nature of their mission, knowing that every hour of delay increased the risk of losing the child to an infection that should be easily treatable with the antibiotics now in her possession. "We can't afford to get pinned down here," she urged, but Marcus was already studying alternative routes that might allow them to bypass this apparent survivor stronghold without triggering a confrontation that could end badly for everyone involved. Jake suggested they could backtrack through the industrial district and approach their warehouse from the east, but that route would add at least 2 hours to their journey and force them to cross territory they hadn't scouted recently. The unknown factor of hostile survivors complicated their calculations significantly, as humans were far more unpredictable and potentially dangerous than the infected they had learned to handle. A voice called out from the sniper position, amplified by a battery-powered megaphone that echoed off the empty buildings surrounding the intersection. "You three in the alley, we can see you. Drop your weapons and step into the street with your hands visible, or we'll assume you're hostile and act accordingly." The speaker's tone was professional but cold, suggesting military or law enforcement background, and Marcus recognized the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Rebecca instinctively tightened her grip on her medical bag, knowing that losing the antibiotics now would effectively sentence Emma to death, while Jake positioned himself to provide covering fire if their situation deteriorated into open combat. The standoff stretched into uncomfortable seconds as Marcus weighed their options, knowing that compliance might lead to confiscation of their supplies while resistance could result in a firefight they were unlikely to win against entrenched opponents with superior positions. "We're not looking for trouble," Marcus called back, deciding that negotiation offered their best chance of avoiding bloodshed while still completing their mission. "We've got a sick child back at our camp who needs medical attention. We're just trying to get home." His military background had taught him the importance of establishing common ground with potential enemies, and mentioning the child might appeal to whatever humanity remained in the other survivors. The response was immediate but not encouraging, as the unknown voice replied, "Everyone's got sob stories these days. You've got 10 seconds to comply or we start shooting." Rebecca looked at Marcus with growing desperation, knowing that Emma's fever could spike again at any moment and turn their successful pharmacy raid into a meaningless gesture if they couldn't deliver the medication in time. Jake had been quietly studying the tactical situation and suddenly pointed out something that changed their entire perspective on the confrontation. "Look at the vehicles," he whispered urgently. "Those aren't random placements, they're creating a funnel that forces anyone approaching to move through a specific kill zone. These people aren't just defending territory, they're actively hunting other survivors. The implication was chilling, as it suggested they had encountered not fellow survivors trying to rebuild some form of civilization, but predators who viewed other humans as resources to be exploited or eliminated depending on their perceived value. Marcus felt his blood run cold as he realized they might be facing the type of survivor groups that had emerged in other parts of the country, organized bands that had abandoned any pretense of maintaining human decency in favor of pure survival at any cost. The 10-second countdown was approaching its end when Marcus made a split-second decision that would determine their fate, gesturing for his teammates to slowly back deeper into the alley while he prepared to engage the hostile survivors in psychological warfare rather than direct combat. "You want to know what we really are?" Marcus shouted toward the sniper position, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in actual combat zones. "We're the advance team for a much larger group that's moving through this area. You kill us, and you'll have 30 armed survivors looking for answers by nightfall." The bluff was dangerous but necessary, as Marcus hoped to plant seeds of doubt about the wisdom of attacking 3 well-equipped individuals who might have backup nearby. Rebecca and Jake understood the strategy immediately and began moving equipment to create the impression they were setting up defensive positions rather than preparing to flee. The response from the hostile survivors came after a longer pause than before, suggesting Marcus's words had achieved their intended effect of forcing the unknown group to reconsider their tactical situation. "Nice try, but we've been watching this area for days and haven't seen any large groups moving through," the voice replied, though Marcus detected a slight note of uncertainty that hadn't been present before. Jake took advantage of the verbal exchange to spot additional defensive positions, counting at least 4 separate locations where armed survivors had established overlapping fields of fire that would make crossing the intersection a suicide mission for anyone on foot. The sophistication of their setup suggested these weren't desperate refugees but organized predators who had been operating in this area for some time, probably ambushing other survivor groups and stripping them of supplies and weapons. Rebecca realized that traditional negotiation wasn't going to work with these particular survivors, so she decided to try a different approach that might appeal to whatever pragmatic instincts they retained. "We've got medical supplies and expertise," she called out, truthfully describing her background while omitting the fact that most of their medical supplies were intended for their own group. "If you've got injured people, we might be able to work out some kind of trade arrangement." Her gambit was based on the assumption that any organized group of survivors would inevitably have members who needed medical attention, either from infected encounters or the daily hazards of survival in a collapsed civilization. The offer also bought them additional time to study their opponents and potentially identify weaknesses in their defensive setup. The hostile survivors seemed to be having an internal discussion, as Marcus could hear muffled voices coming from multiple positions around the intersection, though he couldn't make out specific words. Jake used the lull in conversation to point out something crucial. One of the abandoned vehicles in the kill zone was positioned in such a way that it blocked the sniper's view of a narrow gap between buildings on the opposite side of the street. The gap was barely wide enough for a single person, but it might offer a way to outflank the ambush position if they could create enough of a distraction to mask their movement. Rebecca understood immediately and began checking her medical bag for anything that could serve as a smoke grenade or flash device, knowing that their escape window would be measured in seconds once they committed to action. "Here's our counteroffer," the hostile voice finally responded, and Marcus could hear the predatory satisfaction in the unknown speaker's tone. "You leave all your equipment and supplies in the alley and walk away with your lives. We're feeling generous today, so we won't shoot you in the back if you move fast enough." The ultimatum confirmed what Marcus had already suspected. These survivors had no intention of allowing them to leave with their hard-won medical supplies, and any apparent negotiation was simply a way to manipulate them into a more vulnerable position. Jake tightened his grip on his crowbar while Rebecca checked her pistol's magazine, both understanding that their peaceful resolution options had just evaporated and they were about to enter a life-or-death situation that would require all their combat skills and tactical knowledge. Marcus made eye contact with his teammates and used subtle hand signals to communicate their escape plan, knowing that their survival depended on perfect timing and coordination. Rebecca would create a distraction by throwing one of her emergency flares toward the main sniper position while Jake and Marcus provided covering fire and rushed toward the narrow gap Jake had identified. The plan was risky and relied heavily on the element of surprise, but staying in their current position meant certain death or capture by hostile survivors who clearly viewed other humans as resources to be exploited. "You've got 5 seconds to start dropping weapons," the hostile voice called out, and Marcus could hear the sound of rifle bolts being cycled as the ambushers prepared to open fire on their position. "Now," Marcus whispered, and Rebecca hurled her emergency flare in a high arc toward the sniper position while all 3 survivors broke from cover simultaneously, their weeks of fighting together having created the kind of battlefield coordination that could mean the difference between life and death. The flare burst into brilliant red light just as the first rifle shots rang out, the sudden illumination and smoke disrupting the snipers' carefully planned fields of fire and buying the escaping survivors precious seconds to reach their alternate route. Jake dove through the narrow gap between buildings while Marcus and Rebecca laid down suppressing fire with her pistol and whatever debris they could throw toward the hostile positions. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the empty streets as the ambushers realized their prey was escaping and began spraying bullets in desperate attempts to stop them from reaching safety. The narrow gap between buildings provided temporary cover as bullets ricocheted off concrete walls and shattered windows above their heads, but Marcus knew they had only moments before the hostile survivors repositioned to cut off their escape route. Jake led them through the cramped passage, his mechanical knowledge of building layouts helping him navigate toward what he hoped would be a rear exit that opened onto a different street. Rebecca clutched her medical bag tightly against her chest, protecting the antibiotics that represented Emma's only chance for survival while trying to avoid the broken glass and debris that littered their path. The sound of running footsteps echoed from multiple directions as the ambushers abandoned their fixed positions and began pursuing on foot, their organized tactics suggesting military or law enforcement background that made them far more dangerous than typical desperate survivors. Marcus caught a glimpse of movement from a fire escape above them and immediately pushed Rebecca aside as a hostile survivor dropped down from the second floor, landing hard but rolling to absorb the impact before bringing up a hunting rifle. Jake's crowbar caught the attacker in the shoulder before he could aim properly, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the narrow alley floor. The injured survivor tried to draw a sidearm, but Rebecca had already closed the distance and used her surgical training to apply a sleeper hold that rendered him unconscious within seconds. They appropriated his weapons and continued their escape, knowing that every minute of delay increased Emma's risk while also giving their pursuers more time to coordinate a systematic search of the surrounding area. The gap finally opened onto a side street that Marcus recognized from their earlier scouting missions, putting them roughly 6 blocks from their warehouse stronghold but still well within the territory that the hostile survivors might control. Jake spotted fresh tire tracks in the dirt and debris, indicating that their pursuers had vehicles available and could potentially cut off their route home if they weren't careful about their approach. Rebecca checked her watch and calculated that Emma's next fever spike was likely to occur within the hour, making speed essential despite the tactical risks of moving quickly through potentially hostile territory. Marcus made the decision to abandon stealth in favor of a direct assault on their home position, gambling that they could outrun their pursuers and reach the safety of their own defensive perimeter before being caught in the open. The warehouse district had been transformed into a maze of defensive positions and early warning systems by their group over the past 3 weeks, with carefully placed mirrors and metal sheets that reflected sunlight to create a communication network between lookout posts. Marcus felt relief wash over him as he spotted the first friendly signal, 2 quick flashes followed by a long one, indicating that Tommy Wilson, their designated lookout, had seen them approaching and was alerting the rest of the group to prepare for their arrival. Rebecca increased her pace despite her exhaustion, knowing that Emma might be experiencing another fever spike at that very moment and that every second of delay could mean the difference between successful treatment and losing the child to an infection that should have been easily preventable. Jake used his radio to contact their base as they approached the final stretch, warning their teammates about the hostile survivors who might be pursuing them and requesting immediate medical setup for Emma's treatment. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had trained several group members in basic medical procedures, but she was still their primary medical expert and would need to personally oversee Emma's antibiotic treatment to ensure proper dosage and monitor for potential allergic reactions. The warehouse's main entrance came into view as automatic weapons fire erupted from somewhere behind them, indicating that their pursuers had indeed followed them and were now engaging the defensive positions that Marcus's group had established around their stronghold. Inside the warehouse, Marcus found Emma lying on a makeshift bed constructed from salvaged materials, her small face flushed with fever, while David Chen, a former paramedic who had joined their group 2 weeks earlier, monitored her vital signs with equipment they had scavenged from abandoned hospitals. Rebecca immediately began preparing the antibiotics, calculating dosages based on Emma's weight and the severity of her infection, while Marcus and Jake joined the defensive efforts to repel the attacking survivors who were trying to breach their perimeter. The sound of gunfire echoed through the warehouse as both groups engaged in a deadly firefight that would determine not just Emma's fate, but the survival of everyone who had found sanctuary within their makeshift community. Emma's eyes fluttered open as Rebecca administered the first dose of antibiotics, the child's weak smile providing motivation for every member of their group who was risking their lives to defend their temporary home. Marcus coordinated defensive positions while keeping one eye on the medical area, knowing that their successful pharmacy raid would be meaningless if they couldn't hold their ground long enough for the medication to take effect. The hostile survivors had underestimated the defensive capabilities of Marcus's group, and their attack began to falter as they realized they were facing experienced fighters who had chosen their defensive positions carefully and were willing to fight to the death to protect the children and vulnerable members of their community. By evening, the attack had been repelled and Emma's fever had broken, the antibiotics working their miracle while the group celebrated both their tactical victory and their medical success. Rebecca monitored Emma's progress through the night, noting steady improvement in her condition and vital signs that indicated the infection was responding to treatment. Marcus stood watch on the warehouse roof, studying the city skyline and thinking about the challenges that lay ahead as they worked to rebuild some form of civilization in a world overrun by both infected and hostile humans. The successful defense of their stronghold had proven that organized survivors could work together to create islands of safety and hope, but it had also demonstrated that their greatest enemies might not be the mindless infected, but other humans who had abandoned their humanity in favor of predatory survival. As dawn broke over the ruins of Phoenix, Marcus knew that their fight for survival had only just begun, but Emma's recovery proved that with courage, teamwork, and determination, they could face whatever challenges the dead world would throw at them next.